Hello, and welcome to a new podcast, Is It Worth Saving? Where we try to answer a question every episode. We do a light deep dive, a shallow dip, you might call it, into a different topic to answer the question, is it worth saving? Or that's kind of the loose premise to just kind of get us going. Really, it's about the pursuit of knowledge. The reason for that is that by every measurable metric, I am what you might consider an uneducated man. I would like to change that. By uneducated, I mean formal education. I've gotten by without that, but at 33 years old, I'd never really finished high school, quote unquote, because I was homeschooled. We didn't really have those kind of requirements. It was almost an off-the-books homeschooling as well. Now, I bounced around from job to job. That would be where your formal education typically comes in, and I've gotten to where I'm at, which is a pretty decent job, to be quite honest with you, and I'm doing the best that I can. I spend my free time going outside and looking for wildlife with a camera, photos and videos, and I've been sharing that journey. But I decided to start a podcast because it's a good way for me to educate myself and anyone else who might be lacking in these ways. I may not be a good resource, but I have the internet, and that's where I'm going to try. I'm going to try to learn. I want to better myself, and I want to learn these things. Any things. I really like learning. I've realized later in life that I may have missed out on it early on, but I do like doing that now, and I want to educate myself and change that uneducated title that I kind of give myself. Now, when you just think about educating yourself on things you don't know, that can be really broad in pretty much every way. So you have to narrow it down a little bit and try to figure out exactly what to focus on. And I had this idea, is it worth saving? It gives me a topic. I can think of something that might go away or might be in trouble, and I can narrow down on that specific topic. When I said the wildlife thing, that's kind of where this started with, is wildlife is disappearing. We'll look into that in a future episode, but if we're going to start, I figured, what's the biggest thing that is currently in trouble? The planet. Planet Earth. I've been hearing about that my entire life, that the planet is in danger, that we have to save it, that we have to take these steps. What does that even mean? Planet Earth is the only known planet to us to support life. That is, as I looked up, a 1 in 5,787. Possibly 1 in trillions, or even a sextillion. It's pretty rare. According directly from Wikipedia, as of November the 7th, 2024, there are 5,787 confirmed exoplanets in 4,320 planetary systems, with 969 systems having more than one planet. So out of all of that, we have a 1 with life on it, as far as we understand. Is the planet worth saving? Well, yeah, the answer is pretty obvious. It seems yes, but we should look into it more, I think. Saving from what? Well, again, that's kind of obvious because of what I've heard my entire life, the environment. But realistically, I know very little about what that actually means. So again, let's go to the internet. The Wikipedia entry for Earth. Human activities have impacted Earth's environments. Through activities such as the burning of fossil fuels, humans have been increasing the amount of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, altering Earth's energy budget and climate. It is estimated that global temperatures in the year 2020 were 1.2 degrees Celsius, 2.2 degrees Fahrenheit, warmer than the pre-industrial baseline. This increase in temperature, known as global warming, has contributed to the melting of glaciers, rising sea levels, increased risk of drought and wildfires, and migration of species to colder areas. Okay, that doesn't sound great, but what does that even mean? I continued looking a little bit further and wound up finding something on planetary boundaries. Now, the planetary boundaries is where we actually get into a bit more of the specifics on what exactly everything that we're talking about means. Planetary boundaries are a framework to describe limits to the impacts of human activities on the Earth's system. Beyond these limits, the environment may not be able to self-regulate anymore. This would mean the Earth system would leave the period of stability of the Holocene, in which human society developed. And then there's a list of all 9 planetary boundaries, which I can sum up here. Number 1, climate change. CO2 concentration in the atmosphere. Too much CO2. Number 2 is ocean acidification, which basically means the ocean has too much acid in it. It talks about it with respect to argonite. Number 3 is the stratospheric ozone depletion, less than a 5% reduction in total atmospheric ozone. Number 4 is biogeochemical flows in the nitrogen cycle. Number 5 is global freshwater use, if we use too much of the fresh water. Number 6 is land system change. They mentioned the ice-free land surface under cropland. Number 7 is the erosion of the biosphere integrity. If we lose too many species, plants, animals, whatever it is. Number 8 is chemical pollution. That one's bad, but that one also has a note here with, for one process in the planetary boundaries framework, the scientists have not specified a global boundary quantification. They're having trouble figuring out exactly where the line should be drawn on that one. Number 9, atmospheric aerosol loading, air pollution. And then I can read from the planetary boundaries. The concept of planetary boundaries was introduced to quantify humanity's impact on Earth. Of the 9 identified boundaries, 5 have been crossed. Biosphere integrity, climate change, chemical pollution, destruction of wild habitats, and the nitrogen cycle are thought to have passed the safe threshold. As of 2018, no country meets the basic needs of its population without transgressing planetary boundaries. It is thought possible to provide all basic physical needs globally within sustainable levels of resource use. There actually is a correction to that last point. During my process of researching this and making notes, while researching this, just within the last year, we crossed the 6th planetary boundary. So the 6 now are number 1, climate change. Number 4, biogeochemical flows in the nitrogen cycle. Number 5, global freshwater use. Number 6, land system change. Number 7, the erosion of the biosphere integrity. And number 9, the atmospheric aerosol loading. So what does that even mean? Well, it means we're actively harming the environment and have been since the Industrial Revolution, which made me go, when did that start? The exact start of which seems to be some debate. The 17th century? For our purposes, we can just say more than 200 years. And then I started learning a little bit more about that planetary boundaries. The planetary boundaries are a framework. The framework is based on scientific evidence that human actions, especially those of industrialized societies since the Industrial Revolution, have become the main driver of a global environmental change. According to the framework, transgressing one or more planetary boundaries may be deleterious? Oh, I've never even heard that word before. Or even catastrophic due to the risk of crossing thresholds that will trigger nonlinear, abrupt environmental change within continental scale to planetary scale systems. Now I wanted to finish out that quote there, but I had never heard of the word deleterious. Deleterious, causing harm or damage. It's not quite delete, but deleterious. Interesting. I've learned something. Just kind of the whole point of this. I want to dig a little deeper into that for a bit more explanation. Number 1, climate change. This is determined by 2 variables. The first is what they call atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration, which is measured in parts per million. The pre-industrial base value was 280. The boundary in 2023 was set at 350. Our current value is 417. This comes primarily from burning fossil fuels, but also cement production, deforestation, and biomass burning. Not good. The second part of this number 1 climate change is total anthropogenic radiative forcing at top of atmosphere. I had to look this up. Essentially, radiative forcing is the change in the balance of energy entering and leaving Earth's atmosphere. The pre-industrial value was 0. It was set at a boundary of 1.0, and the current value is 2.91. The next one is the biogeochemical boundary. I didn't get this one at first. I had to look further into it. Essentially, it's the natural cycle of elements like nitrogen and phosphorus. The human activities, especially the use of fertilizer in agriculture, have disrupted these cycles by adding excessive amounts of these nutrients to the environment. It talks about how the phosphorus flow from freshwater systems into the ocean can cause harmful algae to bloom, dead zones in the ocean, and a loss of biodiversity. The pre-industrial level was 0. 2023, it was set to 11 teragrams. A teragram is a unit of mass equal to 1 trillion grams. The current value is 22 teragrams. And then in a similar, the other half of that was the phosphorus. The nitrogen is in a similar situation with the pre-industrial number being 0. The boundary was set at 62, and the current level is 190. The next one is global freshwater use. This one was a bit easier to understand. There's only so much fresh water on the planet, but immediately the chart on Wikipedia mentions blue water and green water. I had to look that up. Blue water, this refers to the water in lakes, rivers, and reservoirs, as well as the groundwater that can be pumped for use. It's the water you can see is often used for drinking, irrigation, and industrial purposes. Green water, this is the water stored in the soil that is available for plants and soil organisms. It's the water that plants absorb through their roots and use for growth, which is then released back into the atmosphere through transpiration. The numbers for blue water were 9.4% pre-industrial, 10.2% the boundary set in 2023, and 18.2% currently. That's the percentage that we can use, the percentage that we shouldn't go past, and the percentage that we are currently using. Green water is pretty much around the same. Pre-industrial, 9.8%. 2023 boundary, 11.1%. Currently, we are at 15.8%. Number 6, land use. This one also makes sense. It's how much forest we have left intact. Pre-industrial, 100%. The boundary was set at 75% from all forests, including 85% from the boreal forest, 50% from temperate forests, and 85% from tropical forests. Currently, we are using 60% of it. That one, the numbers kind of flipped a little bit. 100% pre-industrial, right? No, we hadn't touched any of it. We hadn't started taking everything down yet. Then currently, we shouldn't be using more than 75% total with all those other numbers included. We're at 60%, so we've gone beyond that by 15%. Number 7, change in biosphere integrity. This one is all about species going extinct. There's a food chain. You take out too many links in that chain and it falls apart. Again, this one is split into 2 factors. The extinction rate, which is measured as extinctions per million species. They label it as E-MSY, extinctions per million species per year. This is a unit used to measure the rate of extinction. It's the number of species that go extinct per million species per year, right? There's a background extinction rate that's basically if no humans were around, but naturally some species would go extinct, but it's estimated to be like 0.1 to 1 species per million per year. Currently, due to human activities, the extinction rate is much higher than the background rate. There's not exactly a number, but it's estimated to be 100 to 1,000 times higher, which means we're losing species at an alarming rate. Pre-industrial was 1E/MSY. The boundary was set to less than 10. We're currently greater than 100. Now, the second half of this one is something comparing NPP, net primary productivity, to HANPP, human appropriated net primary productivity. NPP is basically the measurement of new biomass created by plants that use photosynthesis, while HANPP measures the NPP that is appropriated by humans for things like food, fiber, or fuel. So NPP tells us how much energy plants produce. HANPP tells us how much of that energy is being used. That one makes sense to me. I got it. Pre-industrial, the NPP was 1.9%. The boundary is 90% NPP and 10% HANPP. Currently valued at 30% HANPP. So we're using 30% of what's being produced when they're only produced. Like we shouldn't be taking, we got 100%, you divide that up. They should produce 90%. We should only take 10% of that. We're taking 30% of that. 3 times as much. Not good. And the final planetary boundary, number 9. It's about the introduction of new things to the environment. It's called the novel entities boundary. Things like synthetic chemicals or plastics, genetically modified organism, GMOs. You probably heard that one at the grocery store. Here's the thing, they don't have specific numbers for this one exactly. It's still being worked on as of recording this. But the pre-industrial level is 0 and the boundary's at 0. And we're just above 0, so we've crossed it. We crossed the boundary because we went above 0, but it's because we don't know what's happening with this one. Those kinds of materials being introduced into the environment without fully understanding the long-term effects of what it could do. Which reminds me, you ever hear of the Great Pacific Garbage Patch? That's definitely something we can talk about at another point in time, but we've gotten real into the weeds on these ones. But basically it's a giant floating mass of trash, microplastics, etc. out in the ocean, and obviously that's causing a lot of problems. To be fair, the name is a bit misleading. When I first heard about it, I was like, oh man, that's terrible. Let me look at images. There weren't any images that weren't doctored or fake or something like that. Because it's not a giant pile of trash floating on the ocean that's large enough and dense enough you could walk on. It was described more like a chunky soup with random sized bits all over. And the ocean is big. That's why it's that. But it's a lot of trash in the ocean, and there's a problem, and that's hurting the environment. That's hurting the animals that are out there. It's really bad. Anyway. It's around this point where we could continue learning on this path specifically, but I got a little bored. Let's divert to something a little different. What about life off the planet? Is there a future there? Now, I'm familiar with science fiction. I read books and watch movies and TV shows. I'm aware that it is the fiction part of it, but in reality, never really looked up anything. I eventually landed on a page about space settlements. It's a fascinating idea. People living in space. You would have certain advantages as access to solar energy and no clouds blocking your line of sight. That makes sense. We're already well underway with solar power being mainstream here. I hear about it all the time. It'd be cool to get some myself, but because I don't own a house, it's not really all that beneficial to me right now. But I thought this was really cool as I was researching. I found this Wikipedia page for in situ resource utilization. Space settlements may be supplied with resources from extraterrestrial places like Mars, asteroids, or the moon. One could produce breathing oxygen, drinking water, and rocket fuel with the help of in situ resource utilization, ISRU. It may become possible to manufacture solar panels from lunar materials. Well, that's cool. And then I learned this isn't theory. The mission MOXIE, Mars Oxygen In Situ Resource Utilization experiment, happened already. From April 2021 to August 2023, MOXIE was producing oxygen from carbon dioxide in Martian atmosphere. It looks like it happens 10 times over that 2 years and produced 122 grams of oxygen, which is about what a small dog breathes in 10 hours. But that's really neat and clearly a step in the right direction for life off the planet. Interestingly enough, this kind of lines up with what I'm doing in my free time, which is listening to the audiobook for The Martian. If you don't know the story, guy gets astronaut, goes to Mars, gets left behind through an accident, and then has to survive and find a way to get back to Earth. And it's science fiction, but it's really cool because it's really based on some real science, as far as I can tell. And the way that they reclaim oxygen is interesting. Anyway, it was around this point that I fell down a rabbit hole learning about the current rocket launches going on, which in my own personal life, I have mixed feelings about. Launching rockets for tourism seems kind of unnecessary, but without looking into specifics, I don't know if the plan is to use the money from that to then advance the technology to get to the point where space travel is a more realistic opportunity, to not just a tourism thing. Is that going to eventually path the way to people living in space? I get in the grand scheme that seems possible, but again, my own personal feelings, the people heading these private companies are not exactly known for the generosity for the benefit of the entire human population. But space travel is really cool, and you got to start somewhere. And we didn't get to where we were at by only taking the safe route. I get that. I knew that there were rocket launches going on currently because of meetings I've had during work that are taking place during these, and some of our team members have been watching the space rockets in the background, the launches as they go up. I went and watched a couple too. It's really cool the way that they can put cameras on everything. It's neat. It's really cool to see. I just also see the gigantic plumes and the fire and think, is that good for the environment? Now, coming back around to planet Earth. For the current and foreseeable future, we're here. This is where we're at. And there's a lot of us, aren't there, actually? Okay, so in 2017, the United Nations Population Division projected that the world's population would reach about 9.8 billion in 2050 and 11.2 billion in 2100. Ooh. In the future, the world's population is expected to peak at some point, after which it will decline due to economic reasons, health concerns, land exhaustion, and environmental hazards. According to one report, it is very likely that the world's population will stop growing before the end of the 21st century. Further, there is some likelihood that population will actually decline before 2100. So I found that according to the UN, world's population surpassed 8 billion in November 2022, which is an increase of 1 billion since March of 2012. According to a separate estimate by the United Nations, Earth's population exceeded 7 billion in October 2011. Yeah, that's a lot. According to papers published by the United States Census Bureau, the world's population hit 6.5 billion in 2006. The United Nations Population Fund designated 12th of October 1999 as the approximate day on which the population would reach 6 billion. So we hit 6.5 billion in 2006, and they said 1999. That's a much slower rate. It's about 12 years after the world population reached 5 billion in 1987. That was before I was born, but 6 years after the world population reached 5.5 billion in 1993. So anyway, the point of getting to that stuff is that the population of countries such as Nigeria is not even known to the nearest million. So there is considerable margin of error in such estimates. I also found out researcher Carl Haub calculated that a total of over 100 billion people have probably been born in the last 2,000 years. Now, what I found really interesting about that was that we don't know exactly how many people are on the planet, and I get that. I know that it fluctuates every day, and you can't really be I wouldn't expect it to be accurate down to the single digit, but within 10,000 or 100,000 maybe? Not even close, not even to the nearest million for a country such as Nigeria. That's a lot bigger margin of error than I expected. Now, while researching this specifically, I started obviously going off of Wikipedia. I'm trying to collect as many sources as I can. I found a BBC article from earlier in 2022 talking about the same UN prediction at that time of 8 billion people. It mentioned how there is an emerging school of thought that we actually need more people, which is crazy to me. But it says this, I'll quote directly. Others, meanwhile, including the British broadcaster and natural historian Sir David Attenborough, have labeled their swarming masses a plague on the Earth. In this view, nearly every environmental problem we're currently facing, from climate change to biodiversity loss, water stresses, and conflicts over land, can be traced back to our rampant reproduction over the last few centuries. Back in 1994, when the global population was a mere 5.5 billion, a team of researchers from Stanford University in California calculated that the ideal size of our species would be between 1.5 and 2 billion people. Blew through that a long time ago. Now, interestingly, reading through this article, it turns out that this has been a thought for quite a while. I found out they found tablets in Iraq dating back 3,500 years ago that told of the Great Flood, which is a common story through the ages, as it turns out. The cause of it was angry gods, angry at humans for overpopulating and draining resources. Plato wrote about overpopulation. A Roman author 5 centuries later named Tertullian came to a similar conclusion. Now, this article goes on to talk a lot about the negative aspects, like how population control is almost universally hated as a concept. Makes sense. It's due to it usually being part of terrible things like racism or ethnic cleansing, horrible atrocities, which, totally fair. That's not the way I think we should go about it. But it takes a turn and starts talking about something close to home. Wildlife documentaries. It talks about one specific documentary, Indian Ocean with Simon Reeve, and a specific rare lemur that is only known to one part of the world. However, that part isn't the vast open wilderness, it's a small nature reserve surrounded by human activity on all sides. I'll quote directly here. The documentary highlights the wilderness myth, a misunderstanding that can occur when people are presented with majestic footage of the natural world that excludes humans entirely, or drastically downplays our ubiquity, suggesting that there are still vast tracts of untouched land out there. Boy, does this hit close to home in my own personal struggles, finding true wilderness to observe wildlife. Yeah, wow. I'd never heard of that wilderness myth. That's really interesting. The rest of the article is really interesting as well, but it doesn't answer my question straight out. That's because it's a nuanced topic with no one right answer. For example, the article goes into how a population issue in some countries isn't solved easily, such as their aging population not replenishing with enough children. One solution to that, immigration from a country with too much population, is unlikely to be well adopted because, well, immigration. It seems like population both is and isn't the problem, and overconsumption is a factor as well. Now that means, in order to do my part, I need to stop needlessly consuming. And as I look around at this admittedly on the cheap studio setup that I didn't need to do any of that. And thus ends the first and last episode of this podcast. I'm bored. Let's keep digging. So far we've learned about what is frankly obvious. We only have one planet. We are having a noticeable effect on said planet. Space living certainly isn't right around the corner, no matter what some tech trillionaire tells you. So that brings us back to the question, is it worth saving? If I look up that specific question, the first result is an article from National Geographic from a few years ago. It talks about a first-of-its-kind report that shows the global economy would actually make more money by protecting 30% of the world's land and ocean. It throws out numbers such as currently the world invests $24 billion per year in protected areas. It proposes that increasing that to $140 billion, but in return we would see $250 billion in increased economic output and $350 billion in an improved ecosystem services. That sounds like a win-win to me. But that brings us to, quite honestly, the crux of this entire idea for a podcast. In today's age, more so than ever before, how do we find out if something is accurate? I started looking and digging as deep as I could into this report that the National Geographic mentions, the Waldron 30 by 30. It is 58 pages, which is a bit heavy for what I said would be a shallow dip. So surely the summary from articles is enough? But what if that's not accurate? I don't know how to research these things. I don't know what to look into. I know of a term that I've heard before, which is peer-reviewed. It's not the end-all be-all, of course, but it is extremely helpful. However, when I was trying to find out if this one had been, in particular, peer-reviewed, I couldn't find much. Now, when we got to this point, I was kind of out of options. I turned to AI, which had this to say. The Waldron Report 30 by 30 refers to an influential document or initiative focused on the 30 by 30 conservation target, which calls for protecting 30% of Earth's land and marine areas by 2030. The initiative is widely supported by environmental organizations, governments, and scientists, and was formalized in international agreements like the Convention on Biological Diversity. However, the Waldron Report itself is not a single academic paper or peer-reviewed journal article. It was authored by Dr. William J. Bill Waldron and other researchers, and it typically refers to policy reports, working papers, or technical documents rather than peer-reviewed research articles. Reports like these often provide insights, recommendations, and policy proposals, but they are not subject to the peer review process in the same way that academic journal articles are. If you are referring to a specific version or publication titled Waldron Report 30 by 30, it's important to verify whether it's an academic publication or a policy report. You can check its citation information or publication venue to confirm its peer review status. If it's a formal report or white paper published by an organization, such as a government agency, NGO, or research institute, it likely isn't peer reviewed in the traditional academic sense, though it still could be grounded in rigorous research and data. Okay? So, reports are not the same thing as an academic paper or peer-reviewed journal article. So, how do I find out if it's accurate? What I did find was a nice long open letter to the authors of the Waldron Report with 9 points of critique. And when I say nice and long, I mean we're going to summarize it. And by that, I mean I told AI to summarize it for me, and I'm just going to read those points out to you. Recommend going and reading it yourself, of course, if you're more interested in this. This is what the chatbot came back with. Lack of clarity on affected populations. The report doesn't specify how many people will be affected or where they live. Impacts on livelihoods and alternatives not addressed. It proposes conservation areas that prohibit farming and fishing, but doesn't discuss how affected people will find new livelihoods or what alternatives are available. No consultation with affected communities. There has been no consultation with the communities or their representatives who will be impacted by these charges, suggesting a lack of informed consent. Inadequate compensation methodology. The compensation plan focuses only on land value, which marginalizes women and reflects colonial-era thinking by ignoring the social and cultural impact of displacement. Overlooking social science insights. The report ignores social science research on the cultural and social losses that result from losing access to land and resources, which can't be compensated monetarily. Unrealistic tourism revenue expectations. The reliance on tourism to generate revenue is unrealistic, as it often benefits external companies rather than local communities, and tourism itself contributes to climate change. Failure to consider localized cost and distribution. The report aggregates cost at the national level without adequately addressing how these costs will be distributed locally, which is key to the sustainability of the proposals. Insufficient attention to food security. The report doesn't fully consider the impacts on food security, such as price increases, which could lead to greater biodiversity loss. Lack of transparency and data availability. While the report is public, it does not provide access to the GIS layers that form the basis of its finding, limiting transparency. Okay, I'd like to speak frankly for a minute. Hi, this is Frank. I have, just over the course of 33 years living on this planet and being an aware human for, I don't know, maybe half of them, I have a sense of how things don't get done. And that's not really what I want. I would rather have an understanding of how things do get done. But it seems like, and what we just read before is a good example, there is one side of an argument who presents the idea, and the other side that just pokes holes in it. And that, to me, is not progress. It's like if I went to my partner and said, "We're going to eat out this weekend, how about pizza?" And she responded with, "You haven't thought about how eating pizza will affect the person who makes the sandwiches." I get that isn't a perfect analogy. I came up with something a bit ridiculous to just kind of, hopefully you get my point there. My point is that the response is purely a critique and adds nothing to the bigger picture and the original goal that the question was based around. getting some food for this weekend. If you don't want to present your own idea, don't just poke holes in mine. But let's get back to AI. I asked about this exact kind of argument and if there is a term for it. Yes, the kind of argument you're describing is often referred to as a distraction or obstructionist argument. While there isn't a single formal term for this type of argument, it can fall into several categories depending on its nature. Here are a few terms that might fit. Number 1, criticism without constructive feedback. This is a general term for when someone points out flaws or issues in a proposal without offering any solutions or alternatives. It's often considered unhelpful because it doesn't contribute to the progress of the conversation or the problem-solving process. Number 2, nitpicking. This refers to excessively focusing on small, often trivial issues without addressing the larger goals or broader context. Nitpicking can stall productive discussion by diverting attention away from the central issue. Number 3, debunking without proposing. This is when an argument focuses on disproving or deconstructing a theory, like the Waldron Report's proposal, but doesn't contribute any new ideas or solutions. It focuses on the flaws without suggesting better alternatives, effectively stopping progress without offering constructive alternatives. Number 4, a false dichotomy. Sometimes critiques can create a false choice between two opposing options, for example, environmental protection versus economic growth, without acknowledging that both can be pursued in parallel or that middle ground solutions may exist. It may oversimplify the issue, preventing a more nuanced conversation. Number 5, the argument from inertia. This term might describe critiques that don't suggest action or change, but rather keep the discussion stagnant by simply pointing out problems without advancing towards solution or improvements. It can prevent forward momentum in a conversation or debate. Number 6, perfectionist fallacy. This happens when someone critiques a proposal because it isn't perfect or because there are flaws in its current form without suggesting that it's worth pursuing or working through the flaws. This fallacy focuses on the perfect solution rather than a practical, incremental approach. Boy, it gave me a lot of these. Number 7, trolling. In some context, although typically associated with online behavior, trolling can sometimes refer to arguments that deliberately derail a conversation or discredit others' viewpoints without offering any substantial contribution to the discussion. In some cases, critiques that focus on poking holes without providing real alternatives can be seen as a form of trolling. Performative criticism. Number 8, this refers to critiques that serve more to showcase the critic's own intelligence or disagreement with a position rather than contributing to the solution or advancing the conversation. It's about making a point rather than making progress. 9, the polemical argument. A polemical argument is often hostile or aggressive and focuses more on discrediting an opposing viewpoint than on contributing positively to the conversation. While not always unhelpful, it can derail discussions and block constructive dialogue. In summary, an argument that critiques but doesn't help move the conversation forward can be seen as obstructive, non-constructive criticism, or simply a distraction. The term you might be looking for depends on the specific context, but these concepts capture the idea of critiques that don't contribute positively to a larger, solution-oriented discussion. Now, we've gotten way off track here into critical thinking and how I need to be approaching each of these topics in the future. Now, it's extremely useful to know that what I'm reading, and therefore spouting, is accurate. Well, I'm sorry to bury this so far into this first episode of the podcast, but it is the first episode, so it's important to discuss the underlying theme here. I'm not looking for absolute truth. It's an impossible goal, especially when a topic has two sides to it. And there's two sides to every story. There will be theories that are debunked by an opposing argument. There will be bad faith arguments with hidden motives to make you want to believe something a certain way. I remember hearing from my friends about how you can't trust Wikipedia at all while you were growing up, because their teacher told them that it was not allowed. But the truth of that little nugget was that the teacher said you can't use Wikipedia as a source for your report because it's not a source. It cites sources and provides them. I personally do trust what I see on Wikipedia, provided that it hasn't been a recent change to that page. The whole point is that the collective of humans who edit on Wikipedia are constantly fact-checking each other. I've met more than one person in my life who would go to any means to be right in an argument. That's who I picture editing these Wikipedia entries to get the most up-to-date information on the page. Is that right? Probably not, but it's what I, a self-stated, uneducated man, have to go on. Except that I do have a tool at my disposal, the internet. Now, the idea of the internet as it was pitched to us from the beginning as I was growing up is vastly different from the reality of what we live in today. That we'd be able to research any topic and learn anything easily. All right, hold on. I need to search for a website to learn from. So I'm going to use a search engine that's collecting every scrap of personal data about me to sell for a profit. Then I have to dodge the sponsored results that people pay to get you to click on. Would accurate information need to pay? Now, I go onto a website that's also collecting data, so I need to click through the cookie policy to tell it to stop tracking me, and here's a pop-up ad to try to get info from me, and now we can finally learn, and it's paywalled. It's the exact vision that was promised, a free and open internet. I used to just Google search to get the answer to something, and then it got filled with not the answer. When I go, this TV show is great. Is there another season? That's a basic yes, no, or maybe question. Mostly yes and no. What I don't need is a summary up to the show at that point and random speculation to clickbait you. Now, there used to be a neat trick that I would do all the time, which was just putting the word Reddit at the end of a Google search or any kind of search. It's amazing how Google has become the verb when we're just trying to do an internet search. But if you put Reddit at the end, at least you would get directed to Reddit, which was not always accurate. Let's be clear, but it was better and faster and easier and avoided the clickbait articles and avoided all of the nonsense paywalled, and it's completely gone downhill. But the point is that you would be able to get an answer that usually is, should we call it crowdsourced? It's upvoted. And I'd look at the couple top results, right? You got to read a few replies. It may not always be accurate. Judge if someone has debunked it already. Look at the comments to the replies to see whether or not it's actually accurate. There's a funny anecdote that we use often at my job for software development, which is someone accurately was able to, they had a problem. They had a problem with this particular software or code or something along those lines, and they couldn't figure it out. And they tried posting, hey, here's my problem. Here's what I've done. It's not working. And no one gave them an answer. So then they posted it going, here's the problem, and then commented with a secondary account with the wrong information, and people jumped all over it to correct them. That happens all the time. Interesting. That's the human behavior of it. Anyway, I mentioned all that to bring up the frustration of the internet and how I'm trying to search these things and how I'm trying to learn. AI is just another step in that direction, honestly. This is a huge topic that I'm really only looking at on the surface. I have mixed feelings about AI as it is, especially when it comes to using it for creative purposes. That's a story for another time, quite honestly. But for curiosity, let's ask AI about Wikipedia specifically. Wikipedia is generally quite accurate thanks to the contributions of a vast number of volunteers who edit and update its entries. However, because anyone can edit Wikipedia, there's always a possibility of encountering errors or bias. It's a good idea to cross-reference Wikipedia information with other reliable sources, especially for important or contentious topics. Wikipedia can be a great starting point for research, but it's not the only research you should rely on. Just like a balanced diet, your knowledge should come from various reputable sources. So I prompted it to give me sources that I could use. And it gave me the Encyclopedia Britannica, a long-standing and reliable general knowledge resource. Academic journals. Websites like Google Scholar and JSTOR provide access to peer-reviewed articles. News websites, trusted news organizations like BBC, Reuters, and the New York Times are good for current events. Is that how you pronounce that? Reuters? Government websites, sites that end in .gov or .edu, often provide trustworthy information, especially on topics related to health, law, and education. Library databases. Many public and university libraries offer access to databases with credible resources. And books. Academic and professional publications are often a goldmine of verified information. So that's what I'll start with when I start researching topics to talk about. I can use all those resources that we have here. Now, at this point, it's probably important to mention, I've been using an AI chatbot, or several. But just to touch on that, I think it's an extremely useful tool. It's not to be taken without a grain of salt. AI can be very wrong sometimes. Hallucinations are aplenty. But much like the internet as a whole, it can be one of the most valuable tools. Without the internet, I wouldn't be able to do anything I am today. Nothing that I'm currently doing would be possible without the internet. Now, I know AI has a dark history with being trained on people's work without their consent, which is bad. I'll try not to lean on it too much, but like with all the sources I quote, every word that I don't personally write, I'll mention where it came from. Now, let's use AI to get us back on topic. It came up with 5 reasons the planet is worth saving. Biodiversity. Earth hosts a staggering variety of life forms, many of which are still undiscovered. Each species plays a crucial role in maintaining the balance of ecosystems. Resources. Earth provides us with essential resources like air, water, food, and energy. Protecting the planet ensures that future generations have access to these vital resources. Beauty. The natural world offers incredible landscapes, from majestic mountains to serene oceans that inspire wonder and adventure. Health. A healthy planet means cleaner air and water, which directly impacts humans' health and well-being. Moral responsibility. We have a duty to care for the planet, not just for ourselves, but for all living beings and the environment. Then I asked what someone could do on an individual level to help with that, and it gave me a list of 10 things. Now, just going through this line of thinking brings me to mind an argument that I heard from someone on a personal conversation, where how the biggest impact to the environment comes from corporates and big businesses. They need to be the one doing the change. And that argument to me seems like a shirking of responsibility. Just because the change that you make at home is smaller than someone else, it doesn't matter? I don't agree with that sentiment. I think it's one of those types of arguments that we just learned about. And although I agree with the fact that obviously big corporations are a bigger cause, the solution comes from within people. The want and need to change has to be a mindset shift. That can have a ripple effect in where and how you spend money, which seems to be the only real reason that corporations make any changes. Anyway, the 10 things that AI said that I could do are reduce, reuse, recycle. Minimize waste by reducing consumption, reusing items when possible, and recycling materials. Conserve energy. Turn off lights and electronics when not in use, switch to energy-efficient appliances, and consider renewable energy sources like solar panels. Save water. Fix leaks, take shorter showers, and use water-saving features. Support sustainable products. Choose products that are eco-friendly, biodegradable, and sustainably sourced. Look for certifications like Fairtrade, Organic, or FSC, Forest Stewardship Council. Reduce meat consumption. Eating less meat, especially beef, can significantly reduce your carbon footprint. Consider plant-based meals a few times a week. Use public transport or carpool. Reduce the number of cars on the road by using public transportation, biking, walking, or carpooling. Plant trees. Trees absorb CO2 and provide oxygen. Participate in tree planting initiatives or grow plants at home. Educate yourself and others. Stay informed about environmental issues and share your knowledge to inspire others to take action. Support environmental organizations. Donate to or volunteer with groups that work to protect the environment. Reduce single-use plastics. Use reusable bags, bottles, and containers to cut down on plastic waste. Now, I don't want to get bogged down with trying to defend each point in these episodes. Again, we are not after absolute truth. So maybe some of these points aren't actually doing what they purport to do, or they don't have the effect that we want them to. While I was reading this, it brought to mind something that I think about often. There was an episode of Penn and Teller, the magicians. They had a TV show where they argued or debunked topics. Researching it now, it's been criticized as being biased and not presenting all of the facts. But it made for good TV, and I enjoyed the episodes that I saw later in life because it was early on. One in particular I think about often. It was the one about recycling. And from what I remember, the conclusion of that episode was that recycling wasn't actually better for the planet because it cost more. It was still new. The program set up weren't recycling everything that they said they were. Way too much was still going into the landfill, and the extra cost of shipping trash around to other places to be dealt with wasn't effective. There was more, but it was eye-opening to see 10 plus years later when I was an adult and watching it, especially considering about how wrong they were. The reason I even heard about the show was from an interview with Penn talking about how they got stuff wrong. Secondhand smoke was a big one, and recycling. Some of the points that they made were valid, but over time, the recycling programs have grown into being much better than they were 20 years ago. I think about that often. I'm glad two magicians doing an entertainment show didn't kill off recycling. Not that there was probably any danger of that. But I think about it often because when I think about how public opinion changes and different mindsets, you want to see something wild? Look back at the interviews with everyday people when things like seatbelt laws were put into effect, or banning public smoking, or drinking while driving. The outrage is staggering. So I mentioned that to try and smooth over some of the responsibility that I'm quite frankly avoiding taking on. I don't know if everything I look up is going to be accurate. I'll try to do my best, but I'm going to get things wrong. I can guarantee it, especially when I talk about how I feel towards a situation. I'm definitely biased. I'll mention that when I notice it. The point of this whole podcast is for me to learn and to learn how to learn. Again, I'll just mention absolute truth is not the goal. I don't think it's realistically attainable. I think that doing the best that we can is the best that we can, and it's good enough. I don't know if any resource I look up online is going to be accurate to 100%. It's just not going to happen. But I'm going to try my best. I'm going to learn the things that what we learned today. I'm going to learn how to try to research these topics and look at them from objectively different angles, and then just make my own conclusion. And that's for me. And if you come to a different conclusion, that's fine. I'm not here to argue. I'm not here to present things as truth. I'm here to learn. And if anyone learns along the way, even better. The reason that I started doing this is because I thought it would be fun. I want to learn these things as it is. I try to expand my horizon, the mental horizon of my mind and the things that I know. And I seem to do better when I'm creating some kind of content out of it. For the last few years, I've been going out and looking for wildlife and learning about the birds that I see and the landscape that I go into. I've been playing video games. It's a completely different thing, but I do learn about the systems that are in there and kind of how people think when they're designing and building them. That's not nearly as educational, but it's just the things that I'm doing, and I'm growing. In my 30s, I'm trying to grow and trying to cram as much life as I can into what life I have left. And I thought this would be interesting. I have no idea how this is going to turn out. This is the first episode, so here's hoping. So, the planet Earth. Is it worth saving? Well, yeah, I think so. It was just a premise to get us going, right? Like, I needed something. This wasn't actually my first idea for an episode. That's going to be next time. But I think it was interesting. I learned a bit. I learned about what we've known. What I've known in the back of my head is that the planet is in bad shape and we're the cause of it. But I didn't know what specifics that meant. And now I think I've learned that. I think I know a little bit more, and I know a little bit about what I can do individually. Here's hoping that as a community, as a species, as the human population, we can all strive and do better. But that's not going to be something that we can say for every episode. I can't always present a conclusion at the end of like, and here's the fixings. If you want something like that, usually I turn to Last Week Tonight. It's educational, it's funny, it's a great TV show that covers big topics, and I found it really interesting. I've been watching that for a few years now, and I definitely pulled inspiration from that for something of, well, what if I just wanted to do a deep dive into these topics? Or it's not going to be that deep of a dive. I don't think I'm responsible enough to say that I can deeply dive into it because I don't have that researcher background. I don't have any formal education. I'm just a guy, but I'm a guy who wants to learn. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to learn. I think I've said that already. We may have taken a very indirect road into answering the question today, and that's probably what it's going to be going forward. Honestly, this was the first attempt at a podcast. It's most likely the shape that it's going to be from what I have envisioned and what I'm picturing. It's less of a well thought out, well produced research topic and more of a conversation, more of a back and forth of me and where my mind goes as I research one topic and go into the next and into the next. We take a few side turns and then we got to bring it back around. That's most likely what's going to happen. But hey, maybe that's just how I learn. But because at some point you got to call it, I think this is as good as any a stopping point. Obviously, I picked probably one of the biggest topics and such a broad thing to dive into. We could do it all day, but that's what I've got researched so far. Maybe we'll revisit this at a future time after I've learned how to actually research a bit better, but I had to start somewhere. Eventually I can sit there and think back and forth about all these different topics, but at a certain point I just got to jump on it and give it a try. And that's what this episode was. It was trying. Next time we're going to talk about something completely different, but we're going to try to remember these things that we've learned and go into it with that, calling it a researcher mindset, because I want to learn and I got to look at these things up and try to figure it out. Hopefully you enjoyed this. Hopefully it was something listenable. My name is Michael. This has been Is It Worth Saving? A podcast from an uneducated man. If you liked this, if this was at all interesting to you or you want to support it, get it ad-free, there's Patreon. It's probably not an unfamiliar thing if you're listening to a podcast in current year. Yeah, there's a Patreon if you want to support or anything that I do, be it going out and looking for wildlife, trying to make a career becoming a wildlife camera person, playing video games just for fun, whatever the case may be. I do a bunch of it. It goes online. You can look for me. You can't find me by my name, Michael Ward, because there's already famous photographers with that name. So I made up a word, QWOFT, Quaft. You can look it up there. That's where everything is. And of course, there'll be links in the description to probably all of that. I don't know. I haven't figured it out yet. I don't know if this is going to be ad-free because I just don't have people to put ads on it yet. But you know what? Patreon's paying for it. And as an exclusive for Patreon, you get a behind the scenes for this and every future episode of this podcast. I set up a camera in the recording space and there's just a raw output. If for some reason you go, oh, this was great, but what if I wanted to hear every flub and outtake and the way that Michael tries to fit these words in and make sense of it, and it takes a much longer time? Is that interesting? Because that's on Patreon. That'll do it for the first one. Here's to another one. Catch you guys next time. Bye, everybody.